Thank you so much, Sally. Kelly, I'm going to move on. I think that we've spent a lot of time today talking about kind of restoring fertility and that being a sort of an optimal approach to becoming pregnant and sustaining a healthy pregnancy and having a beautiful birth. So Kelly, I kind of want to just turn a little bit to some sort of more ethical questions that come up. The Center for Bioethics and Culture, where you're the executive director, highlights the lack of longitudinal research on surrogate mothers and children born through assisted reproductive technologies. Could you share with us a little bit more about the existing research or personal stories that reveal about the experiences of women and why you believe there's such a significant gap in comprehensive um, data on these practices to date?
For sure. And I really appreciate being a voice here and kind of a little bit different side of things, because I think here we're focused on restoring fertility for women or couples. But I'm here kind of as a voice to women and children in the sphere of technology, reproductive technology specifically. And this is a space, I believe, where the health and well-being of women who freeze their eggs, women who sell their eggs or donate their eggs, surrogate mothers, and the children born of these technologies are being systematically overlooked in current policy frameworks and in our healthcare. So I really appreciate being able to speak on their behalf and share some of the stories. This little studies that we do have, independent research that we do have, and the countless personal stories that we hear in the work of the Center for Bioethics and Culture paint a really dismal or concerning picture of the long-term impacts of assisted reproductive technology, particularly for egg donors. And I use that in quotes because these women do sell their eggs, they don't donate them. Surrogate mothers and the children, again, who are born from these technologies. We know, and we've heard today, that there is a vital connection between a child and his or her biological parents. But there is also an integral and an indispensable connection between a child and the mother that carries him or her. So first, I'd like to talk about surrogate mothers and what we know there. A study most recently in 2024 showed a higher risk for severe maternal morbidity in surrogate pregnancies and adverse pregnancy outcomes for surrogate mothers. Studies have shown collectively that surrogate pregnancies are at higher risk for preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, postpartum hemorrhage or hemorrhage during delivery, and placental abnormalities. I did my own research into this, where I interviewed over 96 women in the United States who are surrogate mothers as well. And our studies also kind of confirm this high-risk nature of surrogate pregnancies after a very emotional and physically taxing process of hormones, hormone therapy, and multiple embryo transfers often. These women are much more likely then to deliver via C-section, sometimes 3 or 4 times more likely to deliver preterm, and are more likely to go home with postpartum depression. After delivery, some of the women that I personally spoke to, and I'm thinking of a woman, and I'll share her story in a moment, but they talk about the emotional trauma, particularly when they bond with the child that they're carrying, and they weren't prepared for that because the language of the fertility industry is very manipulative in that way. I recently interviewed Erica, and her interview can be found on YouTube, as most of my interviews with surrogate mothers. And in her contract, she was to have a little bit of contact with the baby right after birth before the intended parents were to take that baby away. But as the baby was being delivered, they grabbed the baby, and medical professionals started yelling, "No contact, no contact, no photos." She was denied time with that child. And more importantly, that child was ripped away from the only home that child's ever known. And so we're talking about the influence of this connection, this in utero connection and pre-pregnancy. I'm getting beside myself because I want to talk about that in a second. But if this surrogate mother does develop any complications during her pregnancy, let's say preeclampsia, which Erica in this story did also develop preeclampsia, those long-term effects don't end when the baby is born. They will follow her for the rest of her life probably causing chronic health complications later. And to kind of tie that in a bow, preeclampsia, which is a common complication of assisted reproductive technologies, is on the rise in the United States. And if you have preeclampsia in pregnancy or childbirth, you have a future risk factor for kidney disease, stroke, and cardiovascular disease later in life. We know in the United States that cardiovascular disease, which includes heart disease, is the #1 killer of women. So if we put all of this together and go full circle, we can see that there's a dangerously unhealthy cycle for women who are utilizing assisted reproductive technologies or who are being used by these technologies in the case of surrogate mothers. So I'd like to focus just for a second then on that child. This child is created in a lab and it undergoes the stresses of pipetting and other environmental stresses. She or he is carried by one woman and then handed over to another family. And like I said, we know that maternal bonding begins in utero, that a mother's voice, her heartbeat, her emotions, her nutrition, all have a huge impact on fetal development from the very beginning. This child knows that surrogate mother on a primal level. And to dismiss this connection is to dismiss basic biology and human experience. There's a big emotional toll on donor-conceived individuals. I've talked to many of them who talk about the loss of identity, the loss of medical records, and just the emotional part of it. But there's also, we're starting to see now, thankfully, some research in this space that there are health concerns for babies who are born through assisted reproductive technology. And I'd like to name just a few, but premature birth, low birth weight, developmental or medical concerns like ADHD, cerebral palsy, imprinting disorder, heart defects, high blood pressure, insulin resistance. We talked about congenital malformations, and that's just to name a few. I could go on there. And for the sake of time, I won't include egg donors in this conversation, although I'd like to, because they are such an important part of this conversation, because they are completely lost in medical history. We have no long-term data for these women who might go on to develop hormonal imbalances, a loss of their own fertility, and even cancer later in life. They are completely lost in medical history, and they deserve, again, truly informed consent, which they can't. They're told there are no known long-term risks, and they take that to mean that there are no long-term risks at all, and that's just not accurate. And then I'll answer your question. Why is there a gap in this coverage? And the answer is really simple, and it's really uncomfortable, that we have allowed commercial interest to override ethical responsibility. I think if the fertility industry did the research, they'd see the harm, and then they'd have to stop profiting.
Thank you so much. It's such
Dead on.
difficult stories to tell, but thank you so much for doing so. I don't think most people are aware of just how painful that experience is. And it's so, I feel really humbled by everyone's contributions to presenting today really beautiful, strong options for returning to people what they rightly should have, which is really good health and fertility and life force and creative capacities. And so thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to move in just